All right, Express. Express is one of the most popular Node libraries around. It's used all the time to make servers. Backing up a little bit, more broadly speaking, when a server and a client are interacting, it's often using this thing called HTTP. The client sends a request to the server, and the server reads that request, and based on it, it gives us back some data, right? And the format of that request is often in the form of HTTP, which is really just a string, right? I don't want you to make it out to be something more magical than it is. It's just a string. It's a string that adheres to a certain kind of format, where all of the relevant data is in a certain format. It's in a certain way, so it's easy to find relevant information. Importantly, you'll see things like, post, which is the method used in the HTTP request. There's post and get and put. We'll dig into all of these in more detail. What was the URL that was being sent? Notice how it's separated by new lines, so the \n to make a new line. It's not like JSON, which is a different format of data. This is its own thing, right? Its own thing that servers and clients more or less understand. They're on the same page about. Oh boy, that sounds really fun, parsing all of this new data format. No one wants to do that. We could do that, right? We could make a server that isn't natively aware of HTTP, and we write our own HTTP parser that reads all these different pieces of data, separates it by new line, and then organizes it in that way. No one wants to do that. Question? By parsing, I mean reading in a string and interpreting it. So taking in this string of data, this HTTP request, and interpreting it by taking, okay, well, the first thing on this, before the first new line is a post, and then some URL, and then some other method stuff. And parsing it just means taking it from a string and turning it into something in memory, like a data structure. We could build a server with Node by ourselves. We could do everything that Express does by hand, do it scratch. So it has this thing called HTTP, which lets us make our own server, and we could do all of that parsing on our own. It abstracts HTTP requests and responses into these little objects that have some nice methods on them. Here's kind of what that looks like. We can use this fancy require method we were talking about earlier. We could require HTTP. We could do http.createServer to go make a new server instance. And then if we do server.listen, 300 localhost, it will listen for any requests coming in on our local host, i.e. our laptop, on port 3000. We could do a little bit of more stuff. So on a request, whenever a request event happens, here's how we should respond to it. Notice how in the callback method to request, we have an access to the request as the first argument, REQ. And then we can also do things to the res object, which is the response that we will eventually send. This is what we would do if we wanted to build Express from the ground up by ourselves. Question?
So I see it takes another parameters next.
We will get to that. Okay. Yeah, so you're asking, what about this third parameter next that I've heard about? Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about that in an Express context. This is without Express, or before Express, rather. If we're going to do it ourselves, we can do all of these things by making an HTTP server. Notice how it's event-driven. The event is a request comes in, and the response is this callback that we pass here. So when we run this file at the beginning, will we see any of this data? No, it's a callback. We'll only run this callback function when a request comes in. So it's asynchronous. Yeah? Yeah, that's a good question. So where did HTTP come from? One thing I want to point out is, notice how there's no require ./HTTP. So HTTP is not a file that we wrote in this example. HTTP is one of those node modules. And your question is a good one. Is it a node module that we had to install ourselves, like download from the NPM registry, or did it come built in with Node? It came built in with Node, actually, kind of like FS, file system. Yeah?
So the server has a callback function, right? And where is this rec is going to put in?
Where is rec?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it takes a parameter. We don't know what that is, and we don't know where it's going.
Right, we don't know where it is because a request hasn't come in yet. So when we define this callback function that takes in two arguments, rec and res.
So rec is the request.
Yeah, rec is the request.
We need to say that it's a request.
Yeah, I mean, in this example, we're not using request object yet. We will at a later point. But the question is good. What is this request parameter here? It's filled in with whatever data we get from the requester. So whatever the client sends us, that HTTP object that we saw earlier, that'll be filled in on that request object. Yeah.
So like this server.on function is going to be the same no matter the nature of the request.
Yeah.
And we can tell that by rec not appearing there.
Yeah. Yep. So rec will always have something because this callback function would never run unless a request came in. Yeah. It can get more and more complicated. So if we had to parse our own HTTP, we would start doing things like this. So if the request method is head, then we do all of these things. And then assuming it's a GET request, if the request URL is slash, then it's probably something to the home page. And then we're going to res write head 200, res.write welcome to the main page, and res.end. We can do all of this stuff. What we're doing here is we're kind of like building our own parsing method for HTTP. We could do this ourselves. I'm not suggesting that we do, though. Yeah, question?
I'll make it quick. When it's rec.url, that's obviously not a full URL. Are they just taking the last piece, or what is that giving us?
Yeah, so the question is, rec.url isn't clearly the whole URL, because the whole URL usually includes things like http://www.google.com/ something or other. Yeah. So I want to point out that in all of your URLs, you've probably seen something that says http:// or sometimes https://. The reason we don't need to put that in the URL is we already know that they're submitting an HTTP request, right? We've got that. So that's, huh?
It's common.
It's common, yeah, totally. And then why don't we need the host name either, which would be something like www.google.com? Well, that's also assumed because this is the server that's running. You see here on the bottom when we say server.listen 3000:localhost, we've already declared what the host is going to be. In most cases, you notice how we declare the port number of 3000. By default, all the websites that you're using are going to be using port 80 just as a convention. So it's typically just assumed. But yeah, question.
So isn't that a misnomer then? Should it be URI?
Yeah, that's a good objection. So you're saying that shouldn't it be URI instead of URL? I never remember the exact differences between URI and URL.
I think Colin mentioned it. URI is like a resource that you are trying to.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. But URL is typically used to refer to the entire string to get to the website, and URI is more domain specific. I think you're probably right. Yeah. Express is basically just a library that makes all of this work a lot less necessary. It does all that stuff for us behind the scenes. So we're providing that service, but much more easily. Here's what that would look like. So we can say const express equals require express. We can make an app by invoking the function express. So in other words, what this library, what this module express returns, among other things, is a function. And we can run that function to create an instance of an app, like a server. And then to actually make the app go and listen for requests, we can say app.listen and then 3000 or 80 or 8080 or whatever port we want to listen on. To get a little bit more fancy, suppose we wanted to, actually respond to requests. What we do here is we can say app.get, which says listen for requests that use the method get. And then what should the paths be? Well, listen on the path /, which would be basically like the home page or something like that. And what should you do when a request comes in that's a GET request for the home page? Do this, res.send, welcome to the main page. Right? Notice how now there's 3 arguments, rec and res and next. We're not actually, in this case, using rec or next. We would use those in other contexts. But I will point out that when you do res.send, that ought to end the request response cycle, right? Once you've sent a request, you shouldn't send the same request. You shouldn't send the same response again. I think now I'll dig into it a little bit more, and then we'll do an example, because this can seem a little bit abstract. I'll code this out for you. So now we've got basically 2 different rounds. So instead of having this big if, else if, else if, else if, else if thing inside of that HTTP parser we were doing earlier, we can just chain these together. So we can say here app.get and app.get next to each other. This is a response for the home page, and this one down below is a response for /puppies, right? So it's not all one big crazy function. We can declare what we want the server to do when the request comes in at different places. So the home page and the puppies page, right? Okay, a couple summary items, and I'll obviously put the slides up on the repo. I think they're there now already, actually. I want to dig into some code examples. It is. Okay. I'm returning here to the other code example we used this morning. Just haven't changed it at all. In fact, I'm going to git commit. Okay. Wait. There we go. Okay. We'll close some of these. So we have, I'm going to make a server file, server.js, and let's say const is equal to require, like that. We saw that in the example. And then we can make an app by invoking express. And we have to give it a port. One thing I like to do is, just personally, kind of like to put the port up here. So I can just do this. And I didn't show this in the slides, but the app.listen can take a callback function too, which runs once the server has successfully started up. And I kind of like doing that. You'll see that a lot too. So I'm going to pass it in a callback function. I'm going to use an arrow function. There we go. Why am I calling it port? So a server can listen on a variety of ports, and when you kick up the server, you want to know what ports am I listening on. Yeah?
And storing it in a variable means that you can change the port without changing your code all over the place.
Yeah, and to be fair, yeah, so that's why I make it a variable so that I don't have to change the port a whole bunch of different places. To be fair, I don't usually use the port in that many places, but for the convenience here, I like to put it inside of an interpolated string. I don't know.
So this 3000 is actually a specific location, not a. I thought at first it was
Yeah, let me show you. I'll show you what I mean by port. Let's see. Listening on, I'll actually be a little bit more specific. Listening on localhost there. So I could run this by doing node server.js. What do you think will happen when I hit enter now, given that this is what I wrote?
I don't think anything.
You think nothing's going to happen? Why not?
Because app.listen is only going to run when there's a request made to the server at port 3000.
Okay, cool. Any other thoughts?
It's going to start as soon as you start that, and it's going to print that out.
Okay, cool. I'm going to hit enter. And what does it say? Cannot find module express. I'm fooling all of you. What did I forget to do? I forgot to install Express. Yeah, so in other words, what it's doing here is when I did require Express, it's saying I need to find the node module Express, but I haven't installed it yet. I need to go install it. So here I can say npm install Express. I is short for install. So if I do npm I Express, it'll install Express. It does not install it globally. I want to point out that here in my package.json, after installing it, I now see under dependencies, now it says Express. So I've just installed in Express. If I look in my node modules directory, it installed a bunch of things because it is going to install Express and also every node module that Express depends on, right? So it's actually going to install a lot of things. But somewhere along the way, it's going to install Express here. So I just downloaded from the internet all the code that I need to run Express. Yeah? There's a lot to unpack there. So the question is, when you install a node module on one of these projects, where does it go? Is it accessible elsewhere? And if you delete it, is it gone? So let's see. If you install a node module in a project, it really does sit on your computer. It lives there. Like I'm looking at the folder and I see Express over there. And if I were to delete it, then it would be gone and I wouldn't be able to use it. That being said, can different projects use the same instance of Express? Yeah, sort of. So if you have a node module that's installed globally, it will try to find it locally, and if it can't find that, it'll keep looking up and up and up your file system until it finds the global version.
So every time you make a project with Express, are you generally installing it every time?
Yeah, you are. Yeah, every time you make a project and install Express, you are duplicating it. You're installing it again. And if some of you are shaking your heads at the inefficiency of that, I relate. I get that. I get that that's frustrating, and it is taking up a lot of space on your hard drive. Yeah.
Also,
That's always done in the terminal.
Mm-hmm.
And because of this JSON file, anyone running the file doesn't have to do that.
Sort of. So your question is, functionally your question is, if someone else gets this package.json and this project, can they run Express? No, until they say npm install. And when they take your project from GitHub, for instance, and they see your package.json, but they don't have this node modules directory, the first thing they should do is run the command npm install, which will look at your package.json, this guy, and say, oh, I need to go install Express. And that will download a copy of Express locally. Yeah.
So how am I able to use websites that maybe run on Express without having
Ah.
the terminal ever?
That's awesome. I love that question. How am I able to use websites that use Express even though I myself don't have Express? It's because when you go to a website, you don't need Express because you are not the server. When you go to a website, you are acting as the client. And so you, from your web browser, are submitting a request to their server, and their server certainly is using Express, but you don't need to. Does that help clarify that a little bit? So the difference between the server and the client role. You, yourself, you don't need any of these node modules installed. I want to get through this example because we're digging into lab time. So now let's run this again. So now that we have Express installed, npm install Express, node server. So now it says the server is listening on localhost 3000. Let's test that. So here, localhost 3000. Now it says cannot get, it's a little bit hard to see this, cannot get / because that's the route that I went to. Or I could do /puppies, and it would say cannot get puppies, which is a very sad day, cannot get puppies. So let's add some puppies. So I can say res.send, we saw this in the slides, res.send, I'm going to make it large puppies. Right? Notice how what I'm sending is I'm sending a string that happens to look like HTML. Your web browser, whenever it receives a simple old string that it thinks is HTML, it'll render it like HTML. So now, when I refresh, oh, it's not going to do anything because although I ran node server before making those changes aren't reflected. So I have to close this instance and then run node server again. And now if I try to refresh, now I got puppies. Yeah? This is another reason why nodemon is helpful. If I were to do npm install nodemon, or nodemon, or nodemon, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, what it does is nodemon will watch your file for changes. And whenever it sees a change, it'll rerun the file. It'll do that process I just did manually. So now I can do nodemon server, and sure enough, I'll see those puppies again. But I don't have anything at this route, right? At the root route. So let's add something there too. So homepage. And now if you notice, it said restarting due to changes, restarting server.js. And now I go over here and I refresh, and now I see the home page. So it's responding with a request at the root directory, and also responding to requests at the puppies directory. Right, so notice how when I make a request to homepage, it ignores the puppies one, because it doesn't match the route puppies. So it only does whichever one matches the route up there. Question?
You're supposed to send your HTML file.
Right, so in this case, I'm just sending a string, but I could also send an HTML file, right?
I will populate it.
Yeah, so I think I even have an HTML file here, right? This one that has the salmon on it. Let's try that. So, and I think there's a really helpful method in Express called sendFile. I believe this is right. I hope this is. I'm not actually sure if this will work. Let's find out. So this hasn't broken. Go to /salmon. Nope, path must be absolute. Okay, so I think what I have to do here is do something like,
Process that.
I think this might work. Nope, no such file. Maybe I do. Yeah, cool. So every module has a dir name, which is like a reference to its directory. So, and you can see this here. If I console.log like that, and I hit refresh, then in the console you see all of my server-side logs. And it's kind of hard to see, but at the very bottom it's showing you the directory name of the server.js file. Users, FinTurtle, code, 1809, junior. You can see how my file system is organized. Yeah.
If you open console on the browser, do we see both of them or just the?
Thanks. Good question. What are we seeing here? Notice how there's two different consoles. First of all, we didn't see the console log about the directory name, even though that's the route we went to, right? Instead, we saw that on the server-side console log. Instead, in our HTML file, we were loading some scripts here. So inside of our HTML, we were loading client and client B. And it's saying the server responded with a status of 400. It couldn't find them, right? Let's actually get rid of these real quick. I want to show you a different example.
Maybe a quick question. If we have console log and script in index HTML, probably we will see it, right? Because we are calling the whole index HTML.
Yeah, let's actually do that.
Oh,
That's a great example. So if we were to run some JavaScript inside of our HTML, where will we see that console log? Okay. And I got rid of those other script tags. So I refresh, and sure enough, I see the console log from our HTML here in Chrome. But on the back end, I don't see it. Instead, I see the console log about the directory name. So this should illustrate the distinction between Node running on your laptop or on some server somewhere in a basement, and JavaScript running in the browser, right? They have two different consoles. They have two different environments where they can run. Yeah?
Have you tried to console log from the CSS file?
I don't know of a way to console log from a CSS file. I don't think you can do that. Yeah.
So on your server.js page, is there a way to make like so the first one that could be like a wildcard? So right now you have
Sure.
puppies and slamming, but if you just wanted /cat or anything, you didn't know, just to go to the home page.
So you're wondering, what about like wildcards? Yeah, that would work. So let's try this and see what happens. Actually, let's do a res.send. I'm going to call this one something specific. Now let's try to go to localhost 3000 / we got no kittens on this website. So any page that isn't referred to by the above express routes will be sent to that wildcard. It didn't match any of the ones before, but it does match this one. I'm glad you brought that up of like how do we have a catch-all route, because that's very useful. Websites do that kind of thing all the time. Yeah.
Why wasn't it console locked?
Because we wouldn't see it here because that code is in Express. So we didn't see that console log that said I match everything here because we should look for it here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is a thing that you'll become familiar with. When I make a console log, where do I find it, right? And ask yourself, is this file running in Node or is it running in the browser? Yeah.
What if the start of app-get started will be on top of everything? And if you go to like Salmon, what do we get?
Let's try it out.
I have no idea.
So here we still get our kittens 404. Yeah. Just ever see what happened there? I put that wildcard route at the very top. So we learned something by this experiment. The first thing it matches is what gets run. So it matched a wildcard, and so it never saw the route about salmon or puppies, right? So that catch-all route should go at the end. We learned just now that in Express, order matters. So the order in which you add those Express routes has an effect. Yeah, it's a lot like doing that if, else if logic that we were doing manually inside that big exploding function, but it's a whole lot more readable than that. I want to point out one more thing before, because I do want to hand you to the lab. We're a little bit over time. There's a really useful method called app.use. And so app.get will respond whenever a GET request comes in, and it's something you can use to send a response. But app.use is really generic. App.use adds something to that chain of Express middleware, and it just always runs, no matter what the route is. Or that's not true. Sorry, it doesn't run no matter what the route is. It runs no matter what the method is, whether it's get or post or put. So let me just show you an example of that. App.use, and I'm passing in a callback. Okay. Let's go back here. It reset due to changes. And we'll refresh with salmon. Now, notice what's happening here in the browser. It's kind of hard to see, but you see that wheel spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning? It's not giving us our salmon page either, but it should. What's happening here is it's stuck. It's stuck in this app.use. It's never going to go to any of the other middleware. Why did it get stuck? Because we aren't telling it that it's finished. This is important. Express middleware might do something asynchronous. So we don't actually know how long we need to stay in any particular Express middleware. Yeah, and that's what next is for. And so all of these other things like app.get or app.post or whatever, we don't need to worry about those because once they're finished, they send something to the user. So they kind of call next implicitly. With app.use, we have to be explicit about it. So we can call next like this. And next is a function that has to be invoked. And now we have this app.use. I'm the generic middleware. And if we look over here, we can see I'm the generic middleware got called. All right. I want to hand you over to the lab, and then we're going to do another. We're going to probably be a little bit brief with the lab, if that's all right, and then jump into the next lecture after that. Cool.